Hey, ready for another Last Hike episode? Now, you might think that Half Dome is just a normal hike with cables for tourists, and these three influencers thought so too. They called it just like the gym, as they filmed and posed, but their arrogance sealed their fate in a single, horrifying afternoon. What Half Dome did to this trio will make you understand exactly why it's called one of America's deadliest hikes. It was Saturday, the 12th of June, 2021, and the sun had not even cleared the granite walls of Yosemite Valley yet when three influencers laced up their boots at the Mist Trail trailhead just before 6 in the morning. These women had been planning this trip for months. They had matching energy, matching excitement, and honestly, they had every reason in the world to believe they were about to have the best day of their summer. I wish I could tell you that feeling lasted. Before I get into what happened up on that granite dome, I want you to meet them first. Jenna Marie Morton was 28 years old, and she was, without question, the one steering the ship. She had built a small online following by posting travel content, and this Yosemite trip was supposed to be the crown jewel of her summer content calendar. She showed up with a real camera rig, not just a phone, and from the second she stepped out of the car, people said she was narrating her own adventure like she was already editing the footage in her head. Maya Farnsley was 26, the artistic one of the group, always angling for the perfect frame, always noticing light and shadow in a way most hikers never would. She had shown up in hiking clothes that looked incredible on camera and were, according to the rangers, not built for 8 miles of granite switchbacks. And then there was Chloe Gable, 24 years old, the quietest of the three, the one who agreed to come along. Chloe was not in the same kind of shape as the other two, and from the very first stretch of trail, she was already struggling to keep pace. Here's the thing about that trailhead energy. I've felt it myself on trips that had nothing to do with mountains. There is a specific kind of momentum that builds when a group starts a big adventure together, where nobody wants to be the one who says slow down or maybe we should turn back. Everybody just keeps nodding along, swept up in everyone else's excitement. I think that dynamic set the tone for this entire day, long before anyone reached the summit. Jenna filmed an introduction for her page within the first few minutes, hyping up the trip as something nobody else had captured quite like this. Maya was constantly repositioning Chloe for photos, adjusting her angle, chasing better lighting, treating the hike less like a physical challenge and more like a moving photo shoot. She even said that it's just like the gym in a video selfie. Chloe, meanwhile, was already out of breath, asking if they could ease up on the pace. She was more or less ignored. This was still the very beginning of the Mist Trail, mind you. The easy part, before the real climbing even started. About halfway up that same stretch, at roughly 7:15 that morning, close to Vernal Fall, there was a man resting on a rock, eating a granola bar, enjoying being alone with the mountain. His name was Pancho Zulueta, 34 years old, a solo hiker who had driven up from Phoenix and started before sunrise specifically to beat the crowds. Pancho is one of two witnesses whose accounts became central to how investigators pieced together this day. And everything I described from his side of that mountain comes from statements he later gave to park rangers and detectives, since obviously no one was filming him at the time. Pancho heard the three women before he saw them, loud, excited chatter carrying up the narrow trail. When they passed him, he noticed things that stuck with him enough to mention later. He noticed Maya's shoes, which were more suited for a coffee shop than a granite trail. He noticed that Jenna seemed to be paying more attention to her camera than to where she was putting her feet. He noticed their pace, which struck him as rushed for how early it was in the hike. He did not say anything. He finished his granola bar, gave them a few minutes head start, and kept climbing at his own steady rhythm. He never saw them again until much later, and by then, everything had already gone wrong. By around 9 that morning, the three of them had passed Nevada Fall and were cutting through Little Yosemite Valley, still keeping a fast pace despite the miles already behind them. It is worth remembering just how ordinary that trail felt at that hour. Early morning on the Mist Trail is usually full of quiet people like Pancho, folks who came for the solitude and the sound of water rather than for an audience. When a group like Jenna, Maya, and Chloe rolled through with cameras out and energy turned all the way up, they probably stood out immediately. Not because anyone thought they were doing anything wrong, but because the whole tone of their hike was different from everyone else's around them. A few other hikers passed by them that morning too, according to later interviews, and more than one mentioned noticing the same pace and the same distracted energy that caught Pancho's eye. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Why would they? People pass each other on trails constantly, moving at different speeds for different reasons, and there is no rule that says a fast pace or a camera in someone's hand is a warning sign of anything at all. Most experienced hikers would have noticed the exact same things. But noticing is not the same as intervening, and there is no rulebook that tells a stranger on a trail when it is his place to say something to three people he has never met. I do not think anyone should blame him for staying quiet. I just think it's worth sitting with how many small, silent observations happen on a mountain that
never turn into a warning.
As the trail steepened toward the subdome switchback sometime around 11 that morning, the mood in the group started to shift. The sun was climbing higher, the exposure was increasing, and Jenna was growing frustrated that other hikers kept wandering into her shots. She complained about it more than once. At some point, Maya pulled out her phone and showed Jenna a picture she had saved, a preview essentially, of a ledge near the summit that people online had been talking about, a spot with a jaw-dropping view that most tourists never bothered to find. Jenna's whole face changed when she saw it. From that point on, the pace picked up even more. Chloe fell further behind, sweating, clearly exhausted, and clearly anxious, though she kept pushing to catch up rather than asking the group to stop.
Now, let's spend a little more time on that photo on Maya's phone. Whatever exact picture it was, became the entire mission for the rest of the day.
Not the waterfall, not the famous cables. Not the summit itself. A ledge. A spot other people online had visited and photographed. I think about how much of modern hiking culture has quietly shifted from experiencing a place to collecting proof that you were there, and how that shift changes the calculations people make about risk. When the goal becomes the photo instead of the summit, the whole risk equation gets warped, and not in a good way. Further up the mountain, on the half-dome cables leading from the subdome to the summit, just before noon, a woman named Zarmina Jaffrey was making her own solo climb. Zarmina was 29, a medical resident from Chicago, and she had started her hike later than planned after taking a wrong turn near the trailhead. Zarmina is the second major witness in this story, and because of where she was positioned on the mountain for parts of the day, her account ended up covering several key stretches of the tragedy from a distance.
Everything from her side that I describe comes from the detailed statement she later gave to investigators.
Zarmina was ascending the cables using proper technique, gloves on, one hand always gripping steel, moving with the kind of careful deliberateness you would expect from someone who takes calculated risks for a living. Looking up the cable route, she spotted three brightly dressed women far ahead of her, Jenna, Maya, and Chloe, and what she saw concerned her right away. They were taking selfies in the middle of the cables, blocking the narrow path for climbers coming up behind them, laughing without seeming to register how far the drop below them actually was. Zarmina kept her own pace, watching them shrink into the distance above her, and made a decision that would echo through the rest of the day. She assumed they knew what they were doing. She told herself they would be fine. She focused on her own survival on that steel cable and let the three strangers above her fade into background noise.
There's something almost cinematic about the layout of Half Dome's summit, and I think that that's part of why places like that southwest ledge keep pulling people off the marked path in the first place.
The main trail up there is wide, flat, and about as safe as granite 6,000 feet up can possibly be. But human curiosity does not really care about safety margins. It cares about the thing just out of frame, the angle nobody else has, the spot that looks a little more dangerous and therefore a little more impressive. I do not think Jenna, Maya, or Chloe woke up that morning thinking about risking their lives. I think they woke up thinking about a photo, and somewhere between the trailhead and that ledge, the photo quietly became the whole point of the day. I do not fault Zarmina for this either, and I want to be really clear about that before we go further, because it would be easy to look back with hindsight and say she should have shouted up the mountain right then and there.
But put yourself on an exposed steel cable, hundreds of feet above solid ground, gripping for your own life.
Yelling at strangers you cannot even see clearly, hoping they hear you over wind and distance, risking startling them into a bad step that is not an obvious right answer in the moment. It only looks obvious now, because we know how the day ended. By the time Jenna, Maya, and Chloe crested the final stretch of the cables and stepped onto the massive, rounded summit of Half Dome a little after 1 in the afternoon, they had already covered somewhere close to 9 miles on foot and climbed nearly 5,000 feet from the valley floor. Their legs trembled from the relentless ascent, their breathing was still ragged from the final climb, and the strain of the cables had left their arms aching. Yet whatever exhaustion, doubt, or fear had accumulated over the previous several hours seemed to disappear the moment they reached the top. The sweeping granite summit stretched out before them, offering unobstructed views across Yosemite National Park in every direction, and the sense of accomplishment immediately overwhelmed the physical fatigue that had dominated the hike just minutes earlier. The view up there is genuinely one of the most incredible sights in the entire country. The whole Yosemite Valley spread out below like a folded green and gray blanket, granite peaks stretching to the horizon in every direction. They took what felt like 100 photos as seen on the triumphant arrival video they filmed, recorded themselves eating a little food, catching their breath, and celebrated making it. For a few minutes, everything about that day looked exactly like the adventure they had set out to have. And this is usually where a story like this would end, if it were going to end well. 3 friends reach a summit, celebrate, take the safe route back down, and go home with sore legs and a great story.
That's not what happened here, and I think it's important to say clearly that what came next was avoidable.
Not because these 3 women were careless people in general, but because of one specific decision made in a moment of adrenaline and curiosity on a surface far more dangerous than it looked. Near the edge of the marked summit trail, where the established path curves away toward the safer side of the dome, Jenna spotted a thin, worn line etched into the granite. A social trail, the kind that forms not because park rangers built it, but because enough previous hikers walked the exact same unauthorized route to leave a visible mark. That faint trail led toward an exposed viewpoint on the southwest edge of the summit, the very ledge Maya had shown her a photo of hours earlier down on the switchbacks. Without much discussion, at around 1:30, the 3 of them left the marked trail and started walking toward it. Zarmina had only just come off the cables herself, pulling onto the flat granite of the summit, when she caught sight of the 3 women, again now near the southwest edge, appearing and disappearing as the curve of the dome broke up her line of sight. From where she stood, the terrain folded away in a way that hid most of the ledge from view, and what she could see came only in fragments. A flash of color, 3 figures near the rim, gone again behind a rise in the granite. She occasionally caught glimpses of them posing for photos, and at one point saw Jenna farther back than the other 2, appearing to reposition herself for a wider shot of the valley behind them. There is a specific kind of dread that creeps in when you know exactly what is about to happen and the people involved do not. Half Dome's summit is not flat like a table. It slopes subtly toward the edges, and in the summer the granite surface can collect small patches of loose, decomposed granite and gritty sand, making solid stone unexpectedly slick underfoot. It looks completely stable, it is not. Zarmina said that her body tensed the moment she saw Jenna backing up through one of those gaps in the rock. She has said that some instinct in her wanted to shout, wanted to warn them, wanted to do something. But she was still catching her breath from the climb, still unsteady on her feet herself, and a competing instinct held her back, the fear that a sudden shout from a stranger might startle Jenna at exactly the wrong moment and cause the very fall she was trying to prevent. So Zarmina did the only thing that felt safe to her in that instant. She stayed where she was, and she kept watching, frozen between wanting to act and being afraid to. What happened next took, by all accounts, no more than 2 or 3 seconds. At roughly 1:45, Jenna's heel came down on a patch of that fine granite dust, and her foot slid out from under her instantly, with no warning and no chance to recover. Her arms flew out, her camera dropped from her hands and skittered across the rock, and a scream tore out of her that witnesses on the summit described as piercing and immediate. And then she was gone over the edge, the scream cutting off almost as fast as it started, swallowed by open air and distance. Maya and Chloe remained motionless for about a second after Jenna disappeared over the edge. Jenna's camera had landed face up against a rock a few feet away, still recording, and what it caught afterward was more sound than picture. The 2 women's voices, ragged and overlapping, shouting Jenna's name, with only occasional blurred frames as they crawled to the rim on their hands and knees. No reply came back. For the next several minutes, the audio captured them scanning the slope below, shouting Jenna's name over and over, trying to spot where she had fallen. Maya said she thought she could see a walkable shelf a short way down, and started lowering herself over the rim, telling Chloe she only needed to get a few feet closer to look. Chloe initially argued that it was too dangerous, but after Maya had already started down, she reluctantly followed rather than leave her alone. The camera's microphone kept picking up their voices for a while longer, growing fainter, along with the occasional scrape of rock, before it finally went quiet. On the summit, Zarmina looked toward the southwest ledge, just in time to catch part of the aftermath of the fall she had been dreading. Through those same broken sightlines, she saw Jenna's body already gone, already tumbling somewhere below the edge, out of sight. She saw Maya and Chloe at the rim, screaming, and after watching them remain there for several minutes, she thought she saw them climb over the edge themselves, before losing sight of them again behind the curve of the dome. Zarmina has said she could not process what she was seeing fast enough to react. It simply did not seem real that 2 more people would follow a fall over a cliff edge after watching it happen. Below that ledge, the terrain changes dramatically, from smooth granite dome to something much more hostile, loose talus, broken rock, patches of dry brush clinging to a slope so steep that stable footing is basically an illusion. Maya was ahead of Chloe, moving carefully at first, still telling herself she only needed a few more feet to reach the shelf she thought she'd seen, adrenaline likely overriding any caution the deeper into the slope she went. What happened to her next is something investigators later reconstructed from the physical evidence at the scene, since nobody on the summit had a direct line of sight to that specific stretch of slope. Investigators believed Maya stepped onto a large piece of unstable talus that shifted the instant her weight landed on it. Evidence at the scene suggested she attempted to stop her fall by grabbing nearby vegetation, which appeared to have torn free under the force of her weight. From that point, according to the physical evidence recovered at the scene, Maya lost her footing completely and began tumbling down the slope, picking up speed with every rotation, striking rock after rock on her way down. Investigators believe her fall lasted only a handful of seconds before her body came to rest against a large granite boulder partway down the slope. She did not survive the fall.
I want to be careful here because none of us were there and nobody filmed this part. This is the picture investigators pieced together afterward from where her body was found.
It's also based on the pattern of disturbed rock and vegetation on that slope, not something anyone actually witnessed happening in real time. Far below, much lower on the mountain, Pancho Zulueta was making his own way down from the subdome, resting on a rock along the descent route that, from that stretch of trail, happened to open out across the talus below the southwest side of the dome. He heard screaming coming from somewhere high above him and looked up toward the sound. What he caught was a brief glimpse of a blur of pastel-colored clothing tumbling down a steep section of the mountainside before it disappeared behind rock outcrops and scattered trees. Moments later, he saw the tumbling come to an abrupt stop against a cluster of large granite boulders. Pancho has said he knew instantly, from the violence of the fall and the complete lack of any further movement, that the person was unlikely to have survived. Though he could not say with certainty at the time who it was only later, once he learned what the women had been wearing, that he connected the pastel colors to Maya. According to Pancho's later statement to investigators, his mind pieced together what was happening almost automatically, connecting this fall to the 3 women he had passed hours earlier on the mist trail. He had seen 3 go up, now he had just watched one fall and not move, though he still could not say for certain which of them it was. That left 2 others still somewhere above him on that mountain, and he had no way of knowing where. He pulled out his phone immediately and found no signal at all. He was too far down, too deep in the shadow of the rock, cut off from any cell tower. He considered climbing back up toward where Maya had fallen, but the terrain in front of him was a wall of loose, broken rock with no rope, no harness, and no technical gear of any kind.
It's easy, sitting comfortably wherever you're listening to this, to imagine yourself sprinting up that slope, gear or no gear, driven by pure heroism. I've thought about that myself, honestly, more than once while researching this case.
But loose talus on a steep slope does not care how much you want to help. It does not care how fast your heart is beating for a stranger you just watched fall. Search and rescue professionals train for years to move safely through terrain like that, with ropes, anchors, helmets, and radios, and even they treat it with enormous caution. Pancho had none of that. What he had was a phone with no signal, a body already still on the rocks above him, and the terrible, clear-eyed understanding that going up there without gear would likely just add a 4th name to a list that already had 3. I think this moment says something honest and uncomfortable about how limited we really are in emergencies, no matter how much we want to help. Pancho did not run toward danger, and he did not run away either. He sat down on that rock and watched the mountain, completely unable to do anything productive, waiting and hoping someone with the right equipment would show up. That is not failure. That is just what happens when a person without climbing gear is faced with a wall of loose rock and a body that is already still. Sometimes the only honest option is to wait, and waiting feels unbearably passive when someone's life might be on the line. Above him, alone now on that broken slope, Chloe was falling apart. She had just watched her friend Maya tumble to her death, and she was now completely alone on terrain that offered no safe path in any direction. She tried climbing back up toward the summit ledge, but the granite above her was too smooth, too steep, offering nothing for her hands or feet to grip. Going down looked just as impossible from where she stood. In her panic, she spotted a narrow chute cut into the granite, angling downward toward what looked like a small patch of flatter ground. And she made the decision to slide down it on her hands and the seat of her pants, scraping her palms raw against the rock in the process. She reached the bottom of that chute and found herself on a narrow, sandy ledge, only a few feet across, and that was it. That was the end of the line. Below her, the granite dropped away into a sheer polished face, with nothing to hold onto and no visible route down. Behind and above her, the chute she had just slid down offered no way back up without climbing gear she did not have. Chloe was trapped, completely alone, on that narrow ledge, hundreds of feet above the valley floor, with her two closest friends already gone.
I keep thinking about those final minutes Chloe must have spent on that ledge, and I honestly don't know how anyone processes that kind of isolation.
No cell signal to call for help, no way up, no way down. Just granite, open air, and the knowledge of what had already happened to Jenna and Maya. I do not think there is a version of that moment that does not haunt every single person who hears this story. Chloe's isolation on that ledge is, to me, the hardest part of this entire story to sit with. Jenna's fall happened in an instant, almost too fast to process. Maya's fall, based on what investigators pieced together, likely happened just as quickly, adrenaline carrying her forward until the ground simply gave way. But Chloe had time. Minutes, at least, maybe more, alone on that narrow strip of sand, with nothing to do but look at the drop in front of her and think about the two friends she had just lost within sight of that very spot. There was no camera rolling for that part of the day, no witness close enough to hear anything she might have said or thought in those final minutes. Whatever happened inside her head up there belongs entirely to her, and I do not think it is my place, or anyone's place, to fill in those blanks with guesses dressed up as facts. From the summit, Zarmina eventually spotted Chloe, stranded motionless on a narrow sand-covered ledge, but had no way to reach her. Later, she briefly saw what appeared to be a body tumbling farther down the mountainside before it vanished into the trees. Investigators could never determine exactly what happened, as the final moments were only partially witnessed from a distance. Zarmina and another hiker descended until they regained enough cell service to call for help, reaching park dispatch shortly after 2 in the afternoon. Rangers secured the summit by 3:30, while Yosemite Search and Rescue launched a technical rope recovery. Because the three women had fallen into separate locations across steep, broken terrain, the operation continued into the evening, with at least one recovery delayed until the following day. Authorities opened a full investigation into what had happened, interviewing witnesses on the mountain that day, including both Pancho Zulueta and Zarmina Jaffrey, whose detailed statements became central to reconstructing the sequence of events I have just walked you through. Investigators ultimately determined that all three deaths were accidental, the tragic result of three friends leaving the established summit route for an unmarked viewpoint that offered no protection from a genuinely dangerous drop. In the weeks that followed, the bodies of Jenna, Maya, and Chloe were released to their families, and 3 separate funeral services were held in 3 separate hometowns for 3 young women who had left for Yosemite together and never made it home.
If this story has an antagonist, I don't think it's Half Dome.
It's the split second where emotion completely overwhelms judgment, because that's when every chance to stop the tragedy disappeared.